So we can't win that war. We need common sense. And I hate to say it, there really is a shortage of common sense among our political leaders.
Today, we are talking tariffs. I'm joined by Fred Lazar, one of the professors at York University, as well as Schulich Business.
So there's a lot of problems within sort of our business community. And unless we tackle them and address them, we'll continue to lag behind.
Where do you see Canada moving to make the right steps for the country?
To use tariff threats or others as excuse just covers up the fundamental problems we have in this country.
Ooh, that's a hot take, Fred.
We're underperforming. So what's the fundamental problem in this country? Well, there are two, and they're related. One,
The more subscribers we get, the better the guests get. So please hit subscribe and support this Black-owned independent podcast. All right, see you in the show. Fred, how are you? How you doing?
oh, very good. Good day, Alex. Glad to be here.
Most definitely. So, for people who don't know, let's start from the ground level and go up from there. Tariffs have been the talk of the town. Um, what could you tell us about what a tariff is to start? And let's start there and build on top of that.
Okay, a tariff is simply a tax imposed on products that are imported into the country. And, the critical question then is, or one of them, who pays for the tariff? So that's an issue we can discuss. And usually it's going to be sort of a combination of the company that is shipping the product, let's say into Canada, will pay part of the tariff, and then Canadian consumers or users of that product will pay part of the tariff. And the split will depend upon who has the bargaining clout. Now, with regards to tariffs in general, uh, tariff rates are from the Canadian perspective, are governed by our participation in the World Trade Organization and hence the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade. And with regards to the US in particular, our participation in, our trade agreement with the US and then with the US and Mexico. So those trade agreements have basically dictated what tariff rates should be among a large range of commodities. And both those agreements have produced significantly lower tariffs over the past about 75 years.
Yes, most definitely. Now, with what Trump is doing with the tariffs, could you give me quick breakdown of how that affects Canadian society?
Okay, now let's assume they go into effect, and there's no guarantee that they will. Canadian negotiators might actually come to their senses and figure out that there's sort of an off ramp here that works for both countries. But assuming they go into effect, March 1st, the impact of the tariffs, they're going to be taxes imposed by the US on any sort of products, goods produced in Canada that are shipped into the US. So their primary effect will be on Canadian producers, Canadian companies that are exporting to the US. Canadian companies will absorb part or all of the tariff. US consumers will absorb the rest. So that may have a negative impact on the competitiveness of Canadian companies, their abilities to compete with US-based companies in the US market. If that occurs, obviously there are going to be negative consequences for production in Canada, for employment in Canada, and there'll be secondary effects as sort of the negative consequences spill out into other industries.
Now, how do you think actually, I'll take a step back. What's your initial reaction when you heard about the tariffs that Trump is going to impose?
Well, I'm not surprised. I mean, he has sort of a list of objectives, and you know, he's a businessman. He knows from negotiating point of view, you say, hey, this is sort of the cost I can impose upon you. Let's sit down and try to figure out some type of deal that will sort of satisfy my needs and at the same time won't be as harmful as the tariffs to you. That's one of the reasons he's already postponed the tariffs for at least 30 days.
Mhm,
He had made it clear that there were several issues that were important to him during the election campaign. And once he got elected, he said they're going to be priorities. And among them were, of course, uh, immigration, uh, sort of the flow of illegal drugs into the U.S., and national security.
mhm.
And then, of course, trying to repatriate industry to the US. Those were the big issues he ran on during the campaign. So, not unexpectedly, when he introduced the tariffs, his primary goals were to try to sort of pressure Mexico and the US and Canada at this time, eventually the European Union and other parts of the world, to help him achieve those goals. Uh, you know, are the goals can we criticize those goals? Not really. It seems like an overwhelming majority of Americans supported them. So for him, it's how can he achieve them? And he sees this as one way of doing so.
Makes sense. How do you think Canadian real estate will be affected by these tariffs?
Assuming they do proceed March 1st or, maybe within a month later, the negative impacts on our economy, will have a depressing effect. So we're going to have a much lower rate of growth. We might even enter into recession. We will have an uptick in unemployment. Uh, will the governor of the Bank of Canada reduce interest rates to try to offset this? Let's assume they don't. So a recession will obviously have a negative impact on demand for real estate, for properties. So that will have a negative impact on property values in general. If, however, the Bank of Canada tries to sort of minimize the negative impact on the economy by lowering interest rates, that will tend to have the opposite effect. That might encourage people to sort of be willing to take out mortgages at lower interest rates, and that might neutralize the overall impacts on property values in general. However, the auto industry will be significantly affected. That impacts communities in southwestern Ontario. So even with lower interest rates, the employment effects will outweigh the negative, it will outweigh the positive impacts of lower interest rates. So property values in southwestern Ontario will likely take a hit.
Mm. That brings me to an important question. The auto industries in Ontario have been already affected. From companies like GM leaving Oshawa. Um, so, do you see auto industries outside of Oshawa and southwestern Ontario finding new ways of growth? Because Mexico and Ontario are premier locations for auto manufacturing. Could there be pivots that you see happen for them to grow outside of America?
No, they're really connected to sort of the supply chain, the production line in North America. So the parts, whatever is assembled here in Ontario, uh, is shipped to the U.S. That's where the market is. It's not geared to go to any other market in the world.
Mhm.
I think longer term, uh, the most significant impact of the tariff threat, even if it does not proceed, is that it's going to sort of result in many companies rethinking their future investment decisions and saying, you know what, we're going to locate to the US despite the current sort of low value of the Canadian dollar against the US dollar, because we don't want to get sideswiped in a future trade dispute. One may happen, one may not happen, but we don't want to take the chance. And when we originally negotiated the free trade agreement with the US in the mid 1980s, one of the two major reasons for negotiating that trade agreement was to try to be exempt from getting sideswiped when the US initiates a trade dispute with a third country. So we wanted to be protected from that, give a certainty to investors. You can invest in Canada. You're not going to get caught up in a trade war. That was a major argument for a free trade agreement. And given what's happened, Trump's not going to be around for more than 4 years, but can investors who are looking out 5, 10, 15 years trust that a future president will not do the same thing? And that uncertainty is going to influence these investment decisions, which will have a longer term negative impact on our economy.
Mm. Yeah, it's a very it kind of brings a doom and gloom to Canada a little bit. Where do you see us pivoting? I've heard discussions of a China Brazil free trade agreement. Where do you see Canada moving to make the right steps for the country?
Well, again, if you really want to understand what ails the Canadian economy, we've heard a lot about, productivity has basically not improved. Our standard of living has declined relative to the US. We're not as competitive as we used to be. I would suggest you look at two pieces of data. One, how many so-called unicorns? These are startup companies that within a short period of time achieve a market value of $1 billion or more. How many unicorns have been created in Canada in the past 15, 20 years? And the answer probably is just one, Shopify. During that same period of time, how many unicorns have been created in the US? I don't know the exact data, but I wouldn't be surprised if we're looking at 20, 30 or more. So if we use a 10 to 1 ratio, Canada, the US, we're underperforming. Then if you look at the 100 most valuable companies in the world, what are you going to find? 60, 70 of those companies are US based companies. How many Canadian companies do we have there? One, Royal Bank. So again, using that 10 to 1 ratio, we're underperforming. So what's the fundamental problem in this country? Well, there are two, and they're related. One, we don't have sort of a financial system. We don't have a mindset to try to promote, encourage, and help startups, young people, recent immigrants into the country that have good ideas, good connections back to their own countries, to get started. They can't get the funding. If you need anything under 10 million to start up, not available. If you need a few hundred thousand, just not available in this country. So we don't have a real startup mentality, a real entrepreneurship mentality. And then even with companies, small companies trying to get to the next level of mid-size, again, we don't have a financial system that encourages, supports, promotes risk-taking and entrepreneurship. So that's where we're lagging behind. And again, I look at sort of recent immigrant groups. The only time politicians ever, sort of visit these communities is during election campaigns. Between election campaigns, these communities don't exist. Yet there is a lot of talented people out there with great connections. They start companies, but they don't get the financial support and the business support. So that's where we're falling short. And this has nothing to do with tariffs. This has to do with the failure of government policy and really the failure of our financial institutions. So
Mm.
if you're asking pivot, we hear a lot about we should be diversifying our trade. I've heard this since I was an undergraduate in economics, and that was a long time ago. We haven't done it. And if you ask why, obviously, Canadian business leaders always found it comfortable. We're beside the US. You know, why take a risk and go elsewhere? And as our dollar continued to depreciate, well, we could be fat and lazy because the lower dollar continued to maintain our price and cost competitiveness. There was no need to take risks. There was no need to explore and look for other opportunities. So there's a failure with our large companies. And the failure is probably attributable to the fact that maybe the quality of our management at that level is just not that good. And maybe that's a reflection of the fact that, we didn't hire good young people from sort of various types of backgrounds and experiences. So there's a lot of problems within sort of our business community. And unless we tackle them and address them, we'll continue to lag behind. We'll continue to sort of fall farther behind the US and other countries that really are dynamic. And to use tariff threats or others as excuse just covers up the fundamental problems we have in this country.
Ooh, that's a hot take, Fred. Um, so I guess you're not the biggest fan of our retaliatory tariffs then.
Well, you know, what are we doing with those? Basically shooting ourselves in the head and saying, see, we're serious. We're not going to take this. Okay, who's going to get hurt with retaliatory tariffs? Canadian consumers, because largely we're going to pay most of that tariff. So what are we going to do? Increase the prices of certain electronic or consumer products that we import from the US? Increase the prices of food products? The US will look at us and say, go ahead. You want to make life more miserable for Canadians? Feel free to. You have our blessings. So it really is a stupid way to retaliate. And it's done for photo ops because politicians probably don't understand the underlying problems. And even some that do, they don't really understand what needs to be done. I'll give sort of another example. I approached, the CEOs of Hudson's Bay Company many years ago, and I said, "There's no incentive for people to come into your stores. Their flagship store here in Toronto. You go through the main floor. I've said jokingly, you can shoot a cannon down that main floor. You're not going to hit anybody." So I said, "You've got talent, and you have stores right across Canada. You own Saks Fifth Avenue in the US, so you have stores in all the major cities. You have young talent, designers, clothing, other products, food, music, arts. Why don't you go out in the community, find this talent, give them space on your main floors to exhibit what they have. This will give people a reason to come to your stores. Those that succeed, set up an online platform to sell their products, give them space, free of rent in your stores. No response for them whatsoever. Yet, you know, every city across North America has phenomenal young talent, and there's just no opportunity for them to sort of display this and get started. So it's back to the original point I made. Not only don't we have the financial system where we have an opportunity to give them the chance, and again, Hudson's Bay is an excellent example because of their presence across North America. The people running these companies are just totally oblivious to this, and we'll continue doing business as we always have, and eventually Hudson's Bay stores will disappear because they serve no purpose. So it's a long answer to your question.
No, but that was a beautiful answer. I think it needed to be said. I think there is a gap in business to talent in
Yep.
Canada. And honestly, one of the biggest things that's been on my mind is the brain drain that's been happening throughout Canada. And I think the biggest challenge that no one talks about when it comes to tariffs is the brain drain, not just the actual product effect. Because if I'm a university student seeing this, or someone with a lot of talent that wants to start that startup, I might think I'm gonna leave Canada altogether and build a company in the US for the population and the acceptance that comes with being in the US versus being in Canada. Um, that's very interesting. So I guess the bigger thing on a fundamental standpoint is how we can fundamentally change the base level of our country to start being more competitive, you know?
Yeah. I mean, let me get back to sort of what should our politicians be doing? I argued early on, once Trump was elected, whether you like him or not doesn't matter. He's the president. He's going to be around for 4 years. You got to live with him. You knew what he fought for. You knew what he was going to do. Canada, maybe in conjunction with the provinces, but they should have set up a small little group, 3 to 5 people, send them down, early November after Trump won, say, we want to meet with your team and let's discuss what needs to be done to cooperate to make sure there's not going to be any trade dispute. And if they had done that, there would have been an agreement. There wouldn't have been this tariff threat. We wouldn't have lost because of the tariff threat. The only problematic area is access to sort of the dairy market in Canada. We protect it to protect Quebec farmers. It's a political decision. Canadians pay a lot more for dairy products and milk as a result, but that would have been the only problematic area. Anything else, we could have worked out a deal. We could have avoided this.
Mm.
To now just say, oh, isn't this terrible, but not have any viable solution is just ridiculous. Now, with regards to, again, as I said, we've lost because of the tariffs and the uncertainty. I've been approached over the years by many young people who've had good business ideas, and they've always wanted a small amount of money. And I've told them, well, if you want that amount of money, you got to go south of the border. So now, someone who's got a good idea needs a small amount talking anywhere from 25,000 to half a million, and they're looking at the potential of trade wars. That's just going to accelerate their move south of the border. And I read recently some successful small companies in sort of the food industry. They now have decided they're going to expand. They're now currently in Canada, but they're going to expand south of the border. They can't take this chance. So, short sightedness on the part of a Canadian government, you're not going to win a trade war with the US. The US will look at you and say, you're insignificant. You're irrelevant. We don't care that you're imposing tariffs on us. It's not going to hurt us. It's going to hurt you. So we can't win that war. We need common sense. And I hate to say it, there really is a shortage of common sense among our political leaders.
Wow, big statements. Um, Now, one of the things that I feel we haven't leveraged is our minerals, and our oil and our
Yep.
electricity. You know, do you feel like that's something that we can leverage to bolster trade agreements?
The answer to that is no. The primary markets are south of the border, but there's another issue. Oil, minerals, guess what? They are all on the traditional lands or the existing treaty lands of indigenous people. And uh, I know from my contacts across the country in these communities, they are extremely displeased with what has been happening with provincial premiers coming together, doing a Team Canada approach, and not consulting with them and integrating them into coming up with a response. So if Canada tries to restrict US access to our resources, there is going to be a legal case initiated against Canada saying, hey, you're infringing on Indigenous rights, treaty rights, and they're going to ask for an injunction against any such moves by the Canadian government. And yes, it'll drag through the courts, it'll get to the Supreme Court, and the final decision by the Supreme Court may not please Canadian politicians. So we're really infringing on the rights of Indigenous people if we think we can proceed with any measures to restrict US access to our resources. And unless Canadian politicians wake up to this, we're going to have some really serious legal battles which can fundamentally reshape what Canada looks like in the future.
Wow. Hmm. What's interesting too, going back a little bit is that you said that Canada lost from the negotiations. Um, from what it looked like, they didn't feel like a loss because Trudeau had already said that he's going to be committing the 1.2 billion. You know, what made you feel like that was a loss versus a proper negotiation?
Again, if we had gone down early November,
Uh,
asked the Trump team, let's sit down, let's figure this out, worked it out before there was even a threat of tariffs, then the trade war uncertainty would never have materialized.
mm,
Okay, so now tariffs being deferred, it may never be imposed. But regardless, that uncertainty now has resurfaced. Okay, we dodged the bullet this time. Maybe we will dodge the bullet. But if you're investing, whether it's a million, 100 million, whatever the amount is, and you're looking at investment over the next 5, 10 years, are you going to take the chance that whether it's Trump or a future president, that the US doesn't, you know, say, well, we're going to impose tariffs for another reason? Can you take the chance that there will not be a trade war in the future?
mm,
And, investors are going to say, we're really building for the North American market. Let's go into the US because that's the only way we can guarantee avoiding getting caught up in a trade war.
mm.
So the fact that the terrorists were threatened, that's where we lost.
So it's almost
If
the
we could have
market.
avoided that in the first place,
Mm,
then we would have been, I think, much better off longer term.
got you. So it's more avoiding the mindset shift
Yep.
with the investors that they want to be risk avoidant.
Yep.
So the fact that there could be risk in the future brings more challenges than even winning overall when it comes to the trade agreement.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah. I mean, think of yourself. If you're starting a company, you're going to invest millions of dollars, and you said, okay, costs are sort of comparable between the two countries when you take into account taxes and other factors. Would you locate, even as a Canadian, would you locate this side of the border or the US side of the border? Chances are you would say, I'm investing for the long term. I can't trust the Americans, so I'd rather get under their umbrella.
So what do you suggest a young person like me do? Fred, talk to me. What should I be doing?
You should be, first of all, trying to knock some sense into politicians saying, hey, look, I've got good ideas. My friends have good ideas. We need money. We need some other business support. Where are you? You want the future? We are the future. What are you doing? So the Ontario and Ottawa put in what, $15 billion in all types of subsidies to attract two electric battery manufacturers to Southwest Ontario. Imagine if that money had been put into a fund managed, by different people in the private sector to provide 25, 50, 100,000, 500,000 startup capital to you, to your friends and others. We would accomplish a lot more over time. We'd be a lot more successful, a lot more productive, create a lot more jobs than by trying to bribe these two companies to come to Ontario. And at the end of the day, those companies are probably going to regret being here and their technologies will be overtaken in a few years.
Hmm, that's tough. So essentially, you're saying actually part of the brain drain, essentially, or get on get on the politicians' nerves to have startup capital for small entrepreneurs.
Yeah. Go out there and say, we are the future. Either you're going to help us and keep us here and we're going to help the country prosper, or you're going to lose us. I mean, yeah, a number of years ago when one of my friends was running for political office, I think in a federal election, he was in a riding where sort of gangs are quite prevalent. My suggestion to him was go talk to the gang leaders. They really are entrepreneurs. Maybe you can show them, hey, you're entrepreneurs. Maybe there's a different business model. You've got the talent. What's needed to get you to develop these other business opportunities? Deal with them. Now, some of them will just tell you to get lost. Others will say, okay, here's some money, here's some other ideas. We can probably make more money going down this path, which is legal, than continuing to do what we're doing. So, are all gang leaders entrepreneurs people you can work with? No, but I suspect there are a number.
Hmm.
So you go beyond that. As I said, there's a lot of talent across this country. We just don't support it. We don't utilize it. We don't try to capitalize on it.
Mm, got you. Now, when it comes to the economics and tariffs currently happening, I'm still learning. I'm still somebody that's curious. Um, what question do you feel like I didn't ask you that I should have?
What are the longer term outlooks for tariffs? Possibly one. Uh, what might be the greatest threats to us in trying to negotiate?
Hmm.
So, with regards to longer term trends, tariffs are being heading down. And, by and large, they're not a significant impediment to trade. There are still some tariffs, somewhat higher in some products than others, but compared to 20, 30, 60, 70 years ago, they really are insignificant.
Mm,
There are other trade barriers that have arisen that are more significant. Foreign ownership restrictions, various subsidies, uh, those are more difficult to deal with. So, with regards to the second question, where are we most at risk in trying to work out an agreement with the US? And I would suggest the most contentious issue is going to be dairy products. In sort of the last round after 2.0, the US wanted unlimited access. We were able to keep them to, I think, about 10, 12% of the market. That still annoys them. Wisconsin dairy farmers want uh, unimpeded access. Wisconsin is one of those, critical swing states. They're going to have influence politically in the U.S. Uh, Canadian politicians want to protect dairy farmers in Quebec. So that's going to be a difficult one to resolve. What's another possible area that may be difficult? The U.S. may say, you know, the exchange rate, 150 Canadian per one US dollar, that gives you an unfair advantage. We want you to try to move the exchange rate back down to parity, closer to one for one. That's easier said than done. And that might be another contentious area.
mm,
Otherwise, you know, anything else the US may want probably works to our advantage as well.
that's interesting. So you just said the fact that our dollar is weaker gives us a competitive advantage. So it's in the US's best interest that our dollar rises.
Yep.
Interesting. I never thought about that. I thought it
You
actually gave the US companies an advantage so
know,
they can shop here and buy our products and services for pennies on the dollar.
Well, that's right. That's why it helps when we ship to the US. Okay. And US companies, and again, if you think of Trump, he wants more production in the US. Well, this cheaper in Canada because of our dollar. And prior to Trump making announcing the tariffs, I think the value of our Canadian dollar is about 135, 136 per US dollar. It's now 150. So there's already been further depreciation, which offsets, from the point of view of Canadian producers, I think about half of the tariff threat. And if the tariffs go into effect, you can expect the Canadian dollar to probably go towards about 160, 165 US. So for Canadian producers, the depreciation will largely offset the negative impact of the tariff. But
Mm.
it's the impact on investment decisions uh, that don't disappear.
Got you. Got you. So do you see that being something the US would actually try to execute, bring the dollar up? Or
That's a that's a possibility. I look at what are the contentious areas, access to the dairy market, the value of the dollar. The US will also demand that we eliminate foreign ownership restrictions in a number of industries. That probably will benefit Canada because we'll get more competition
Mhm.
where possible. So that's not going to be a negative for us.
Interesting. Interesting. So in the long term, our dollar could increase. Is that
The
something
US may demand that. If
how does US demand that? Like how can Trump say I want your dollar to increase and how would we increase that dollar? Like what would be those steps? I'm so curious.
that's the tough part. Easier said than done. How could they do it? Well, theoretically, the Bank of Canada could increase interest rates. That would lead to a recession in this part. The recession may have a negative consequence on investment decisions, which would make it even tougher to move the dollar towards parity. Could it be done? I'm not sure it would be too successful, and the cost to Canada could be even more negative than living with the tariffs. So I'm saying if you're looking at what are the greatest problems, most contentious problems in the negotiations, those are the two that stand out.
Mm,
Most everything else, easy to deal with.
mhm.
Will the US demand that we move the dollar closer to parity? Don't know. But if I were advising the US, that might be one of the demands. And then let Canada figure out how to do it. Whereas, in fact, they probably would have a lot of trouble doing that.
Yeah, I could imagine. I could
Yeah.
imagine. So in the short term, do you see our dollar going down in the short term?
That depends on what happens March 1st. March 1st.
If the tariffs go into effect is what I'm saying.
If they go into effect,
Yeah.
yes. We're going to go to about 160, 165 Canadian for every dollar US.
Ooh, that's tough. Okay. For the young entrepreneurs in our audience that's thinking about their next steps as an economist, what are some of the suggestions you have?
Uh, yeah. Unfortunately, young entrepreneurs, you need money, you need business advice. Uh, at this point, it's south of the border, regardless of what happens to tariffs. Unless our politicians finally come to the senses and realize the problems and start getting serious, working with our financial community, creating a real angel investor network, really creating dynamic and risk taking venture capital, perhaps using some of the expertise in business schools across the country. Young entrepreneurs in this country, to put it bluntly and crudely, they're screwed.
Wow. Wow, this has been an enlightening conversation.
I wish I would be more positive. I'd like to be more positive. I think we could be more positive. You know, it's not as if we don't have the talent. It's how do we give them that opportunity? And more importantly, and equally important, I guess, how do we retain them?
Hmm. Very much so. Very much so. If you look at the media space in Canada, a lot of our creators, a lot of the people who are actors, they all go to the US to find a fruitful career. So I can only imagine what it's like in the business sector as well. Okay, well, I was working towards wrapping up. Um,
I
where?
said,
Go ahead.
I wish I could be more optimistic for you.
Yeah.
There is a lot of room for optimism if we do the right things rather than, well, let's wrap ourselves in the Canadian flag and complain about the bullies south of the border. And let's keep shooting ourselves by trying to retaliate rather than looking inward and saying, okay, what has gone wrong in the past 10, 15 years in this country?
Hmm.
What needs to be done to correct the problems?
Got you. And to correct them, you're saying bolster entrepreneurship, um, I also would probably add a real estate into there because it feels like our real estate economy has gone down the toilet. Um, where else do you see areas of opportunity for um, Ontario and Canada as a whole?
Yeah, I mean, longer term, uh, again, has work to do with the indigenous communities. Where's Canada's future? In the north. Uh, all the new resource projects are going to be in the north. What's missing there is infrastructure.
Mhm,
There are no roads, there are no rail lines, no ports. The airports are really sort of secondary.
mhm,
There's a potential to actually create a Northwest Passage. I think it's now usable about 10 months a year. We could create ports up in the north.
mhm,
What's the shortest shipping route from Asia to Europe? Through the Northwest Passage, not through the Panama Canal, not through the Suez Canal. There's enormous potential there.
mm,
So we need large scale investment to develop those regions. And it's only going to be done with the help of the indigenous people that live there. Again, from the US perspective, military cooperation. What's the shortest route from Russia or China to the US? Across the North Pole. The US is already investing a lot of money
in
in
Greenland.
military bases there. Well, let's cooperate with them.
Mm,
Let's invest with them, get them to help finance the needed infrastructure. So the North is where the future lies. Let's look to it. And the future also lies in utilizing the talent we have in the South, utilizing the talent with each new wave of immigrants into this country.
interesting. Now, you bring up a really good point about the Northwest Passage. Because of that, of course, we see Trump investing in Greenland, as well as asking us to be a 51st state. What's your opinion on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think he originally threw out the 51st state as a joke, and he saw the reaction, and he says, well, "This is great. They took me seriously. So you know what I'm going to do? I'm just going to keep rubbing it in and rubbing it in because he's enjoying as we're sort of twisting around. Oh, we're not going to be. We're not going to be. Look, the reality is, no Republican Party is going to want Canada as a 51st state. All it's going to do is guarantee two more Democratic senators, and a majority of Congress representatives will be Democrats. And Canada will never become the 51st state. Okay. Impossible. There is no interest among Canadians. And furthermore, even if you put it to a vote, I'm sorry, you're now infringing on Indigenous rights. So Canadians alone can't make that decision. And the Indigenous people, you know, they're reluctant to be part of Canada. They're going to be even more reluctant to be part of the US. So that's a non starter. We should have treated it as a joke and move on from there. With regards to Greenland, all he really wants is military bases in the northern part of Greenland and access to resources. That's what he wants. Why would he want the rest of the country? It's not going to be a tourist destination. It has no other value.
Interesting. Awesome. Fred, thank you so much for joining the show. I really appreciate it and all of the hot takes you provided. Ladies and gentlemen, hustle what you can't control. So control your grind and control your life. I'm Alex.
And it was a pleasure being here. Thanks for inviting me, Alex.
My pleasure. All right. See y'all soon. Peace.
Take care.